Chapter 12. Violence, Legitimacy, and the State. Economies of Force. Max Weber, in Politics as Vocation, influentially defined the modern state in terms of a monopoly on legitimate violence within a territory. This rather complicated idea became deeply ingrained in the critical social sciences, and it is with that familiar idea, the Weber that we think we know professionally, als Beruf as it were, that we are concerned. As so often in the case in professional discourse, the little matter of the truth, whatever the real Weber might have thought, or more politely, our best reading of Weber, must be placed safely in its alcove. Nonetheless, by way of entry, the famous passage is worth quoting at some length. Violence is, of course, not the normal or the only means available to the state. That is undeniable, but it is the means specific to the state. And the relationship of the state to violence is particularly close at the present time. In the past, the use of physical violence by widely differing organizations, starting with the Klan, was completely normal. Nowadays, in contrast, we must say that the state is the form of human community that, successfully, lays claim to the monopoly of legitimate physical violence within a particular territory. And this idea of territory is an essential defining feature. For what is specific to the present is that all other organizations or individuals can assert the right to use physical violence only insofar as the state permits them to do so. The state is regarded as the sole source of the right to use violence. The state here is an ideal typical notion. Weber is trying to define what the concept of the state means. As an ideal concept, the state cannot be defined by describing the particulars of its various instantiations. If Weber's concept of the state is ideal, however, it is not the sort of timeless ideal sometimes called Platonic. Instead, Weber's ideal types are rooted in social affairs, history. Weber's ideals are abstractions from the messiness of the world. Perhaps it is useful to remember that Weber was a legal historian and professor of law before the sociology he helped found as a discipline was institutionally established. From the perspective of law, the statement of a rule organizes, suppresses, distills what happened and what should happen, but such statements are nonetheless engaged with a situation, sometimes decisively so. Ideal types, like law, thus strive to be simultaneously practical and responsive to the world, pragmatic and yet just, true, and logical, or more bluntly, both in and out of time. Turning to the world, however, is little immediate help with constructing a generalization that we can confidently call the state. There is too much data, as it were. There seems to be no rule that organizes the activities of those things we agree on calling states. Weber is explicit. The state cannot be defined sociologically by enumerating its activities. There is almost no task that a political organization has not undertaken at one time or another. But by the same token, there are no tasks of which we could say they were always, let alone exclusively, proper to the organization that we call political, and nowadays referred to as states, or that historically were the forerunners of the modern state. Instead, Weber turns from the activities commonly undertaken by governments to the means available to the state as an organization trying to work in the world. It is rather the case that in the final analysis, the modern state can be defined only sociologically, by the specific means that are peculiar to it as to every political organization, namely physical violence. A certain kind of listener will immediately recall that Carl Schmitt defined politics as the distinction between friend and enemy. The state can use such force itself, or it can grant the right to use force to other actors. But actors other than the state have no right of their own, that is, other than as licensed by the state to use violence. For purposes of defining the state, however, a difficulty with violence is that widely differing organizations have legitimately used violence, as Weber recognizes. But the era of various forms of collective violence, Weber is careful to say, is over. The entire passage is riven with historical qualifiers. He defines the state nowadays, just after World War I. The state's monopoly on legitimate force is specific to the present. Thus, Weber's famous monopoly of legitimate force turns both on a normative claim, legitimacy, and on an understanding of history, and specifically modernity, at least as understood by Weber after World War I. The state is defined in terms of the monopoly of legitimate force because it is the modern organization with the right, that is, the legitimate authority, to use or to delegate the use of violence as a mean. Conversely, modernity is the era in which force is monopolized by the state. The tautological quality of the complex of ideas does not make the complex untrue. Indeed, something like this is the dominant and largely tacit worldview in any number of self-consciously modern contexts like North Atlantic universities. Still, each word, modern, monopoly, legitimacy, and territory, are problematic in intertwined ways in the contemporary fields in which we find ourselves. To elaborate this understanding of history, whence this notion of modern comes, let us tell a story. Depending on when and where, the king certainly expected people to be armed in his realm, just not in his presence. And violence was to be expected, but not every day. The church especially forbade fighting on various holidays. Over time, the disarmed areas were expanded. Similarly, the number of days on which fighting was prohibited increased. And who might bear arms also became curtailed. Peasants were disarmed, at least to the extent possible, given the violent uses to which workaday tools may be put. During the course of this evolution, bearing arms was often a privilege granted by the sovereign to nobles, who were thereby associated with and extensions of the crown. The privilege of carrying swords and other noble privileges were abolished as society modernized. Eventually, the citizen was expected not to bear arms anywhere or fight, ever. Violence was the rarely used prerogative of the sovereign, carried out by minions. Today, such minions are called soldiers, agents, even assets, that is, understood to serve or even be the property of the state. Many Europeans and others today think like this. In modern settings, perhaps by definition, ordinary people are not prepared for violence. They are not armed, and often want the law to ensure that other people are not armed either. This rather Hegelian view of the evolution of the state reaches its logical and world historical conclusion in Bismarck Weber's Germany, or shortly thereafter. Examination. This progressive conception of the arc of history runs into problems. Most states, in most times and places, are, by this logic, only partially achieved. Non-state actors use force all the time, and states use force in a territory governed by other states. Weber insists that the state must be successful in establishing its monopoly, so one might save the definition by insisting that in such places, such states are only embryonic. But then there are few real states, and we are left without a name for the form of organization that governs much of life in much of the world. In short, the prevalence of collective violence undercuts the sociological ambition to describe state organizations and societies as they are encountered, not as they might be imagined. It is possible to salvage much of Weber's definition by dismissing non-state violence as criminal or otherwise illegitimate, and it may well be as a matter of law, that is, from the perspective of the state. But the law may be contested, too. Al-Shabaab, ISIL, the Nicaraguan Contras, Timothy McVeigh, the IRA, and any terrorists who claim to be freedom fighters of one sort or another are precisely contesting the legitimacy of the state. And any number of what might, broadly speaking, be called mafias must have some degree of local legitimacy, whatever their crimes, in order to function. Such organizations may be more or less legitimate, and more simply, they may win or lose, but that seems to be a question of strength on the ground, not whether a territory had a state. Nor does the link between legitimacy and violence seem all that tight. Paradigmatic states, such as France and maybe the United Kingdom, key sources of our very notion of what a state is, exercise violence that is not, or not entirely, felt to be legitimate. U.S. history provides any number of sobering examples, yet it is difficult to argue that the United States is not a state, whatever the legitimacy of its violence. Perhaps the modern state has a monopoly on all the legitimate force, and may also use some other not-so-legitimate force besides. But when it uses such force extraterritorially, as all of these countries do, does that mean that the territories involved do not have states? Does a drone attack de-state a place? And so forth. Lawyerly games aside, Weber seems to have had in mind a very well-ordered society, headed by a strong state, in which organized violence is exceptional and everyone knows what side to be on. Germany, perhaps, gave such an impression for a while, but that hardly seems enough for a general rule, or a definition of the state as such. In the heart of Europe, however, it is not at all clear that violence is legitimate only when and as authorized by the state. In Glasgow, on the Tallis train, on Utoya Island, people stood up and used force against their attackers. Did they not do so legitimately? No government granted them the right to do so via some legal process. Neither the United Kingdom nor France nor Norway objected, of course, but surely the legitimacy of a young man's defending himself against a marauding attack does not spring from the state of Norway. But conversely, the existence of such violence does not mean that Norway or France or the United Kingdom is not a state. Since politics is vocation, significantly delivered between the two world wars, history seems to have gone down a path different from the one presumed by Weber. In the United States, the largest economy in the world, many people are armed in public every day. Nor does this right flow from the state, at least as a matter of law. As gun aficionados never tire of saying, the Constitution says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Whatever the Second Amendment means, the people had guns before they had a constitution. Worldwide, security is a huge and growing private enterprise. When it protects a home or a business, ADT Armed Response presumably operates with a license from, but is hardly an agency of, the government, except in the general sense that the government is for property, order, and the like. Civil society, in short, employs force as a means in any number of situations. It just does not seem to be the direction of history that physical violence is the specific means that are peculiar to the state. When it does employ violence, the state has a huge range of ways to do so, from the classic national military to unarmed police with arresting powers and various forms of contractors in different situations. It is only with difficulty that these are all thought of collectively as a unitary state. In particular, the recent revival of the use of mercenary forces, often organized as corporations and called contractors, is due in part to the desire of the United States at least to be able to deny direct knowledge of or participation in certain actions. In a conversation where David naturally stands in for the U.S. government, "You hired us because you didn't want your soldiers to do these things." At the same time, professional soldiers can be meticulous about the terms of their contracts, leading to some strange stories, like the tale of the leader of a terrorist organization who was somewhat accidentally captured by a group of contractors in a theater of operation, a story told to David by one of the contractors. The contractors radioed in to ask for direction. Their client said release him for diplomatic reasons that need not concern you. Somewhat bewildered, the contractors released the leader, and he lived on to direct the fight for quite some time. What exactly is the state here? Perhaps most importantly, the end of World War II saw the erection of the modern political order that David has elsewhere called the City of Gold. That is, the enormous project of European integration and globalization in lieu of politics centered on the nation-state. Part of this integration was explicitly military. The UN Charter outlaws war in general and then provides numerous useful exceptions to the rule. The claim of public international law after World War II, however, is that the choice to go to war does not belong to the state. Operationally, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization takes over a great deal of what had once been thought of as national defense, especially in Europe. The United States has a wider purview. And the Germans themselves were largely disarmed and remain somewhat limited in their choice of weapons today. It is hard to say that all of this means that Germany is not a state. It is true that Weber, in the German tradition, is talking about the idea of the state. On the ground, variations are to be expected. But Weber is a sociologist. The concepts of sociology are supposed to be empirically grounded, not mere philosophical hypotheses. We could find places that fit the Weberian idea of a unified state with a monopoly of force, perhaps China. But such places hardly represent the ideal or the course of history in the globalized world. By and large, even after the rise of so-called populism, most continental Europeans do not want a unitary state. Instead of a monopoly on physical violence held by well-organized states, the contemporary seems to be marked by a rather mixed political economy of force, in which states, whatever those are often enthusiastic if somewhat fractured participants. Insults. And yet Weber points us to something very important. People often do think of the state in terms of physical security and hold public authorities responsible for providing it. The state is expected to use force as necessary to protect airports, for obvious example. Actual attacks are perceived and largely discussed as failures of the state, which did not detonate the bombs or start the shooting. Nor is the state allowed to claim the status of victim, even though the state incurred losses, and in a democracy at least, the state might be thought to be we the people. At least in Western societies, however, attackers are often treated as, if not exactly blameless, somehow beyond moral judgment and not worthy of much discussion. In fact, discussion of attackers is often actively discouraged, lest they get too much attention. Attackers are perfunctorily called cowards, and the business of blaming the state begins. Knowing this, security professionals operate under the specter of their own failure. The expectation that the state is responsible for security effectively brackets the terrorist and sets it in opposition to the state. Bizarrely, or perhaps not, the particularities of those killers now known as terrorists recede. They must have had particularities, not just because everyone does, but because very few people cast themselves as the doomed protagonists of their own violent dramas, and then act their dramas out upon an involuntary populace. It is special behavior. But all such particularities are submerged by the vast category of terrorist. For this reason, it seems unlikely that political sensitivity often plays much of a role in shifting the focus of public discourse to the state's many failings. People may be unwilling to inflame ethnic, racial, religious, or other animosities, but how often do they think the terrorists or their ilk have much to give them, or that they be engaged? How would they be engaged? And, frankly, many terrorists are idiots. Special forces speak simply of the bad guys that they are prepared to eliminate, sometimes point blank in one of the less domesticated cities of the world. Some of this language, this simplification of people to cartoons, expresses ordinary lack of concern for the foreign or the dehumanization required for combat. Much such abstraction, however, is tactical and operational, and often bureaucratically managed. From a security perspective, a terrorist is a subset of bad things, violence, etc., that could happen in or to area, infrastructure, persons to be secured. Perhaps a marauding shooter is just crazy in the theatrical style of many American attacks, or perhaps he's some sort of white nationalist racist, or who knows what is going on, as in Las Vegas. None of this matters operationally, at least not in the event. Shoot first. At this juncture, terrorist is a little more specific than adversary or threat. It names an opposition to the state, a kind of failure. As faults of the state, terrorist attacks, or even threats of terrorism, require governments to act, and to be seen to have acted. Security theater is required in fulfillment of the people's expectations that government provide security, or at least try. Otherwise, those that speak in the name of the people, also known as candidates, will insist on change. After an attack, nobody says, "What else could we have done? Those guys were really evil motherfuckers, and talented too." Not even after 9/11. Instead, Congress established a massive commission to investigate the failings of the security apparatus, albeit with some attention to the identity and motivations of the attackers. The terrorist as such is not completely irrelevant, but is primarily defined in opposition to the state. Shifting the focus from terrorism to security, from the attackers to the watchers on the walls, also transforms the stale academic question of what is terrorism. The question has never been answered satisfactorily. It cannot be answered precisely insofar as the question is understood to require an answer in the form of a neutral or objective description of the attackers and their violence. The variations of attacks that might be called terrorist are endless. Moreover, even if we were to define terrorism precisely, surely our completely right answer would not affect how airports are built, or more generally, our understanding experience of the contemporary. Terrorist, much like security itself, is not a noun that names a thing, but a placeholder that allows a certain kind of discourse. Terrorism names an ill-defined set of actors and actions opposed to the state. That is, terrorism is an antagonistic concept which cannot be defined or even adequately described in isolation. Effort to be scientific, objective. Much social science scholarship makes just this effort. Once we define terrorism, we can really get to work. But definition never comes. The lines between terrorism and crime, or war, or revolution are too murky. Madness and ideology cannot be untangled. Principled consensus does not arise. Meanwhile, always, the work of security has already begun, with or without adequate definition. The bollards are ordered, the new guards are being interviewed, and so forth. The terrorist is already being defined, not in principle and ex ante, but antagonistically as a presumption of the defenses under construction. The terrorist today can be discerned in the shape of the castle going up, even if we know that tomorrow may require a new castle. The scholar, in her own good time, publishes another effort at definition, at drawing sharp and defensible lines. The failure to understand terrorism as antagonism, framed by Weber's understanding of the state, creates another problem. Much security scholarship is of the form, X number of people die from A, Y number of people die from B, X is smaller than Y, so we should worry more about B. We should worry more about, say, ordinary crime than terrorism. We do not, and the social scientist shakes her head ruefully and repeats herself. The error in such thinking is the politically plausible, secularized, Christian, but wrong-headed notion that all deaths are created equal. Lives may be equal in the mind of God, but they certainly are not in politics. While all men are mortal, as the syllogism has it, deaths from natural causes do not really figure in security discourse. An epidemic or a hurricane may receive political attention. AIDS did, albeit far more slowly than it should have. Hurricanes get airtime, perhaps some federal aid, perhaps not so much, if the place hit is, for example, Puerto Rico. Even violent deaths are not all equal. Ordinary murders, domestic spats gone horribly wrong, hot-headed kids outside bars. So sad. Gang violence in the barrio is not a good thing either, but, and you can certainly imagine this reaction, privately or at least in small groups, what is one to expect? The same gang in the airport, however, is not at all acceptable. SWAT teams will be called. That's what critical infrastructure means, critical to our operations, worthy of being violently defended, without much by way of legal nicety. Islamist militants targeting office towers or the Pentagon is really not acceptable. Wars will be started. To be blunt, from the perspective of the state, some violence is not only a failure to provide security, but is also an affront, an insult. While many killings get filed under shit happens, insult to the state, or labeled terrorism. Terrorists know this, at least implicitly. Insult is entailed in the conception of a terrorist act, not least bodily insult, but often also more overtly public than the killing of innocent ordinary folks who happen to be in the wrong place. The September 11th attacks were specifically designed to destroy symbols, that is, not just to kill people, but to be as insulting as possible, and indeed to drag the United States into a war it could not win. And the insult was felt. The United States reorganized a chunk of the government, started some wars, which it has not won, but which as of this writing appear indefinitely manageable for some long period of time, hence forever war, as shadowy operators moving through much of the developing world. In this, at least, the terrorist insult was successful. The degree, too, and ways in which the state can be insulted says something about the state. It turns out that some people, at least in civilized places, get emotional about the monopoly of legitimate force, indeed may refuse to concede other possibilities. The United States, as noted, gets insulted, as does New Zealand. Attacks may be discussed with rather embarrassed language. More interestingly, the insult may be explicitly denied altogether. "Don't say his name," the Prime Minister of New Zealand intoned. After the Manchester Arena attack, in which 22 people, many young girls, were killed, crowds sang, "Don't look back in anger." What? In other places, almost nobody, certainly not the government, has much confidence in the state's capacity to provide security. In Kenya, in Jamaica, or Mexico, in Ireland for most of its history, nobody is very surprised by breaches of the peace. The government of Kenya catastrophically mismanaged the Westgate Mall attack and then moved on. A great many children died needlessly. Many places do not have much of a government. Life is dangerous. In such places, physical safety may be understood to be personal, or at least local, and provided by the people themselves, rather than by a more or less distant state. At some point along this continuum, it becomes senseless to talk about security, and one speaks of war zones. That is, physical security is not least a moral claim upon the state, and different states have different capacities to deliver on their obligations. States are not equally obliged to provide the same level of security throughout their territory. Different places within a given territory may be more or less safe. Airports are considered to be safe, but clubs and bars less so. Traditionally, schools and houses of worship are safe, places of sanctuary. This brings us closer to where Weber was trying to go, or when, in theory, modernization, from the perspective of the modern state, is importantly the claim of the state to provide security, which starts in safe places and then extends to the entire territory. Conversely, terrorism is not a question of political agency, get out of Palestine or Somalia or found the caliphate, but the extent to which the state's claim to provide security is publicly frustrated and the state is embarrassed. To sound postmodern, terrorism strictly understood is not possible until the state claims to offer security, and such claims can be violently disproven. "Surprise," say the terrorists. "Surprise, motherfucker," goes the counter-terrorist's favorite reply. Intolerable. Terrorism as cloudy mirror. Imagine that we are inclined, still following Weber, to equate legitimate violence with the state, as discussed above, even if this seems to be an inadequate understanding of contemporary violence. Imagine further that we understand the state in rationalist, enlightened terms, or at least hope to do so. The widespread fury over recent populist political developments suggests that many people believe in the rationality of politics, which makes many contemporary developments outrageous. Imagine, in short, the worldview of many a European or American academic. From this perspective, it can be hard to comprehend not only recent politics, but state actions that are less rationally or at least transparently organized. We are somewhat at a loss dealing with snipers, irregular fighters, contractors, Vietnam in general, and latterly JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, everywhere in Africa. What happens when a passing operator, a foreign national with a car trunk full of specialist weapons, makes a reasonable decision, given the horrifying scene before him, then over roughly 18 hours violently resolves a large-scale al-Shabaab attack by fighting, building by building and floor by floor, through an upmarket office, restaurant, hotel campus that could have been in any well-heeled global city and not a few urban combat video games. Or when police officers in Dayton just happen to be outside a bar, so that when a man begins firing, so do they. Within 32 seconds of the first shot, the attack is over. 10 people, including the attacker, die in consequence. Or perhaps SWAT team members attend a barbecue, weapons in their vehicles, of course, enabling them to respond quickly to heavily armed bank robbers. We may defend such actions in toto and after the fact, but the point here is epistemological and not normative. If we are honest, there's not a lot of bureaucratic rationality at work, skipping bullets and flip-flops. And just why do off-duty or even visiting special forces operators drive toward terrorist attacks? Because that is just what such people do, not because that is the rational plan of the enlightened state. Calmer and more public moments, and working in the other direction, we tend to attribute organization to violent actors, that is, to make them state-like and to give them political, in the ordinary sense, interests. In short, the enlightened and rational political imagination is likely to imagine terrorists in the familiar terms with which the state is imagined. In particular, terrorist violence is interpreted in political terms. Terrorism, as Clausewitz said of war generally, is thus a form of political expression, a kind of language that must be decoded. To make matters worse, terrorists often accompany their deeds with words, often styled as a manifesto. But as is so often the case, rationality may be less than claimed, and it would be silly to assume that a terrorist language means much. Maybe the terrorist has a point, putting the question of slaughtering innocents aside for a moment. Surely Irish independence can be defended. There are lots of bad things about technology which may yet be the end of us all, as the Unabomber pointed out, and so forth. But suicidal killers of innocents reposition themselves on the normal distribution with their final act, in a tight relationship between what might or might not have been said by way of political theory or justification of violence simply cannot be assumed. The Dayton killer cited leftist politician Elizabeth Warren, an erstwhile Harvard Law School professor, as justification for mayhem. Elizabeth Warren? Why should terrorism be engaged as politics? Obviously, this is an error of political thought, yet it occurs with each attack. Terrorism, if it is effective at all, demands interpretation. Survivors struggle to make sense of an attack. As already suggested, the interpretive frame is likely to be political. Almost unavoidably, killings are interpreted in terms of available political commitments and understandings. Survivors have little else with which to work. So, why would one not see anti-Semitism or racism or rage about Palestine or what have you, especially if the attacker says such things on his way out? The New York Times read the El Paso attacks as a white nationalist call to arms. Less sympathetically, violence also provides an opportunity to rally the troops and generally further one's own interests. David's university president used the killings, distant though they were, to extol our and his virtues of diversity and inclusion. Bad taste, but understandable. Diversity and inclusion are good things, racist shooters at Walmart are bad things, and presumably we should all bear witness. If one instead wants to think, however, there remains the question of how to read terrorism. As Olivier Waugh has been arguing for decades now, political languages are few and far between. So the discontent of young white Europeans tends to be articulated in terms of the Jews, even in places where there are virtually no Jews. A great deal of anti-Semitism has been achieved in fact. Many Europeans convert to radical Islam, which provides a different vocabulary. In the United States, especially in the age of Trump, one should not be surprised to see familiar racist tropes. Political speech here is in the nature of fashion, a sort of in-the-air availability of a language. While this language is expressive, and of course dangerous, it is generally silly to take its argumentative form seriously, to expect that a terrorist argument can be refuted or satisfied on its terms. By the same token, terrorist speech and action may be politics in the broadest sense of engaging and affecting human relations, but such speech is not and does not even aspire to the state of political discourse, as that phrase is understood in the polite corners of a modern republic. Terrorist violence is political, but it is so in the sense that Jung, say, is political, or fashion is political. The python of culture consciousness recoils itself. It is a mystical enterprise. And this is a problem for us, for we have our limitations too. The French Revolution literally declared politics to be the source of transcendence, explicitly supplanting religion. At the same time, politics was supposed to be rational, although the Jacobin and later Napoleonic taste for spectacle should have raised suspicions. Melville cuttingly ends Billy Budd's Sailor with an encounter with the French warship, the XIII. Such enlightened aspirations for politics, nowadays often called liberalism, did not completely take, of course, although both the rejection of religion and the broader claims to science wandered into Marxism, a dominant political tradition and the dominant tradition of social critique. From this perspective, the ground of human experience must be understood to be politics, and politics must in turn be understood in a fairly rationalistic sense, not, for example, as hatred of another race, however politically salient such hatred may be. Thinking that violence, never mind terrorism, can be delimited by the terms of rationalistic politics is, as was once said of metaphysics, nonsense on stilts. The problem is that as a polity, we have little else, or at the very least, little else that we can say publicly while talking politics. Novelists can at least convey that, whatever else it may be, collective violence is not rational. Again, consider Slaughterhouse-Five or Catch-22. But at the level of public discourse before and after an attack, what should the government do? The presumptions of the enlightened state and polite discourse must be maintained. So we see the transposition of events into a familiar political idiom, and unsurprisingly, often a self-serving, that is partisan, one. We criticize the state and badge the killers terrorists to be understood in terms of states. Jurisdiction is expanded and officials are hired. Sometimes whole agencies are founded. Let no mass killing go to waste, as it were. Again, terrorism is not a cultural phenomenon on its own account, but as it's said, defined antagonistically, named by its victims. Terrorism is an insult, a shadow, perhaps a nightmare, but an image without an independent existence. Therefore, terrorism, as a genus of collective violence, cannot be defined, in part because reaching such a definition requires us to define ourselves. Rephrased, we have any number of definitions of terrorism, as of the self, but none are ultimately satisfactory. The ceaseless failure to define terrorism makes sense in the same way that being unable to catch one's own shadow makes sense. The state is opaque to itself, even, especially, the putatively enlightened modern state, as novelists never cease reminding us. Weber sensed this irrationality at the heart of politics, the struggle with Nietzsche, the sense of disenchantment that might be relieved by the emergence of the charismatic leader. Weber did not live long enough to see how dangerous such leaders could be. To be clear, none of this is meant to imply that attackers do not have politics. Collective action requires organization, something of a politics. As Weber says, violence can be organized by many different kinds of organization, and was in the pre-modern era, and is now too, as we have seen. Attacks deemed terrorists are carried out by a bewildering variety of groups with wildly varying levels of rationality and countless ways in which their intentions are articulated, even justified. We may imagine violence in terms of a continuum of rational organization, with maybe Richard Reed, the would-be shoe bomber, at one end of the spectrum, and the Prussian general staff at the other. Those things we denominate terrorists occupy any number of points along the spectrum. The IRA was a bureaucracy. Their Army Council was always squashing innovation in South Armagh or excessive fundraising in Boston. Richard Reed was, as Special Forces members would say, a muppet. Somewhere in between one finds the Red Army faction and the Shining Path and the Lufthansa pilot who flew a plane load of school kids into a mountainside, to say nothing of people who drive through Christmas markets or bomb marathons. It is hard to generalize. People will disagree anyway. And at some level, who cares? That is why we call them terrorists and stop thinking. Enlightened modernity only goes so far. Not much further than Weber got, if any.